you. Meg Bishop is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Human Development and Family Sciences at the University of Texas at Austin. Meg leverages approaches at the nexus of developmental psychology, public health, and demography to examine the developmental and cultural contexts that support LGBTQ+ youth to thrive. Meg is currently exploring how the timing of sexual identity development has changed for sexual minority people in the last several decades, and how this timing relates to mental health both during adolescence and into adulthood. Ultimately, Meg's goals in their research is to produce rigorous research that informs programs and policies aimed at eliminating inequities experienced by sexual and gender minority people. Welcome, Meg. We're so grateful to have you.
Thanks, Dr. Fish. Thanks for having me, and thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm really honored to be here today in a community of people with similar interests and passions. I really admire the work that the UMD-PRC is doing. So again, just thank you so much for having me. Really excited to talk to you today about the Stories and Numbers project. Stories and Numbers is a WT Grant Foundation funded project that's a partnership between the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Health and Rights Lab at UT Austin, which is led by the fantastic Dr. Stephen Russell, which is where I work, Out Youth Community Center, which is an LGBTQ focused youth community center in Austin, Texas, and Equality Texas, which is a policy focused nonprofit working to promote the well-being of LGBTQ youth through legal and policy change. And so the purpose of the Stories and Numbers project is to leverage research and stories to support LGBTQ young people and those who work with them to make positive change in schools. Today I'm going to spend a bit of time telling you why we're doing what we're doing with respect to what the research says about strategies that support LGBTQ youth to thrive in school. Then I'll tell you a little bit specifically about the Stories and Numbers project, so what it is, some of the resources we have available, and how the project can best serve your schools and communities. Okay, so you're here today, so it's likely that you know from experience or interest that schools are often unsafe for LGBTQ students. Many LGBTQ people experience negative or hostile school climates, including bullying and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity at school. And these negative school climates and discriminatory experiences can threaten LGBTQ students' well-being. So this form of discrimination is associated with all of the things that we try to prevent at school. So things like high-risk behaviors, mental health problems, compromised academic success, and the feeling that school is a safe place to be. We also know that the past several years has been particularly heinous with respect to attacks on LGBTQ young people's rights, with specific attacks on trans youth. So this legislative session in Texas, which is where I live and where the Stories and Numbers project is based, there have been more than 30 anti-LGBTQ bills filed. Nationally, 8 states have passed anti-trans laws, with 29 others attempting similar efforts. And often these bills target queer young people in school contexts. So it's become really obvious that schools are intentional targets of homophobic and transphobic political agendas, with politicians playing off of fear-based narratives that don't actually have any scientific grounding. But the result is that queer young people's health and well-being is suffering, as you can see from the data collected via the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey on the right here, which is showing that trans young people are reporting much higher vulnerability to bullying at school, feeling less safe at school, and lots of the health risk behaviors that come with that discrimination. So that's the bad news. The good news, though, is that, despite these egregious attacks on the rights and health of queer young people, LGBTQ youth are amazing, they're thriving, and they're loved. As part of this project, we've been traveling around Texas and other parts of the country, talking to students, teachers, policymakers, parents, everyone from algebra teachers to social workers to bus drivers. And there are so many people, like folks on this call, who are really eager to support LGBTQ young people and eager for the information and the tools to do so. And the other piece of really good news is that we have good science on how to do that. So we now have about a decade's worth of research about what works to make schools better for queer young people. So what works to reduce homophobia, transphobia, and to support LGBTQ young people to thrive at school. And so empirical research makes a really clear case for the effectiveness of four main strategies that I'll talk about today. So the first is inclusive and enumerated policies. The second is school personnel support and training. The third is student-led clubs like GSAs. And the fourth is access to LGBTQ related resources and curricula. And I'll talk much more about each of these throughout the talk. And so we have this really definitive research evidence. We have lots of folks who want to support LGBTQ young people and the need to do that. And so how do we leverage all of this? So the goal of the Stories and Numbers project was to produce a research review summarizing this evidence specifically for use by LGBTQ young people and the adults who support them. The cover of this research review is on the left of the screen here, and it's accessible on storiesandnumbers.org. And then the other goal of the project was to couple the research review with a strategic engagement plan and tools designed to build capacity of students, school staff, and parents to combine the research evidence with their personal stories to make the case for positive change in schools. And so on the right here, you can see a screenshot of our website, storiesandnumbers.org, and an example of palm cards with the four strategies that we have distributed at conferences and throughout school districts. And acknowledging that ultimately we are the experts of our experiences, the idea was that the research would be combined with folks' own stories to make a compelling case for supporting these safe school strategies to people like administrators, policymakers, and others. So this is what the landing page of the website looks like. It's where you can check out stories from students and teachers. You can see what the research says, and you can find resources like fact sheets that have been specifically developed in response to community needs and requests. So these focus on topics like what makes a good GSA advisor, or why is inclusive sex ed important? And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the talk. So as I mentioned, the project revolves around providing stories, numbers, and resources related to these evidence-based strategies that we know work to keep young people safe and supported in school. And so now I'll talk a bit about the research evidence for each of these strategies, as well as research-based recommendations for activating each strategy in schools and communities. So first we have inclusive and enumerated policies. So these are anti-bullying and non-discrimination policies that explicitly list the status characteristics of students that may be the basis of bullying or discrimination. So an example of an inclusive and enumerated policy would be something like, you can't discriminate against people based on actual or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity or expression, or race, religion, or other identity characteristics. Whereas a non-enumerated policy would be something like, we don't tolerate bullying at this school. And enumerated policies are protected for students in several ways. They provide explicit guidance around implementing anti-bullying policies. They signal to the school community that homophobia and transphobia is not tolerated, and they clarify for students their rights at school. So there's strong research that says that in schools with enumerated policies, students are safer and have higher achievement, and teachers are also more supportive and are more likely to intervene in bullying. What's really amazing about this research, and actually a lot of the research that I'll discuss today, is that implementing these policies benefits the whole community, not only LGBT students. So for example, when we compare students in schools that do or don't have these policies, students who attend schools that have enumerated policies report better mental health and less substance use. And even at the state level, students in states with enumerated anti-bullying laws report less harassment and fewer bias remarks. So no matter what kind of research method you use, whether you're looking at the individual school, or state level, students are safer when these policies are in place. And if you're advocating for change in your school or district, it's really important and compelling to be able to say that these policies and practices benefit the entire school community. Okay, so hopefully you're on board with the research evidence for implementing enumerated policies. Now I want to share an example of the story side of the project to demonstrate how folks are combining their personal experiences with the research evidence. So this is a story from a local Austin family about why inclusive policies are important to them.
Hi, my name is Matthew Shedd. This is my awesome husband, Jim, and we are parents with two wonderful kids in the school district. We grew up gay in Texas, so we know what it's like, and kind of led to our advocacy work for LGBTQ youth in our district and our city. I think some questions that come up for families are like, what if a kid asks why another kid has two moms? How should a teacher handle that? Or even like at a middle school level, if someone uses the word gay as a derogatory phrase, or someone comes out to a staff member as bisexual or trans, what is the appropriate response? And I've heard several kids in our district say that when they have an issue, they go to administration, but administration doesn't really know how to handle it. So they say, oh, it's a school board issue, and the school board doesn't want to handle it, so it goes back to administration. It goes back and forth until some little issue has become this giant mammoth full of pain and negativity when it could have been avoided if there was a clear-cut policy. That's why it's so important for teachers and staff, counselors, anyone who comes in contact with our kids on a daily basis to have a clear policy, because if they don't know how to handle these difficult, sensitive situations, how are they going to model that behavior for our children?
Okay. So, it's clear that these policies matter. They help to keep LGBTQ young people safe and supported in school. And so now I want to talk about some research-based recommendations about advancing these inclusive and enumerated policies. So first and foremost, we need to be enacting these policies at the state and federal level. There are currently 21 states and DC that have these kinds of policies. And it's really important that all states enact them. But in the meantime, school personnel can establish local policies. So, what we do in this school or in this classroom or in this district to keep all young people safe and supported. School personnel, parents, and students need to learn about the policies in their school districts. So basically, we have to know what the policy is in order to enact it. So one really tangible strategy is to check out your school or school district's website and see what the policy looks like. And then we have recommendations at each for each strategy for students. So, sometimes we think about students as these passive recipients of these things, when in fact, students are change makers. They can make a lot of things happen. So students can use our website and other resources like the Movement Advancement Project or the National GSA Network to raise awareness of the need for inclusive and enumerated policies, and they can advocate for local and state policy change. I also just wanted to highlight that in March, President Biden passed two executive orders: his executive order on preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation, and his executive order on guaranteeing an educational environment free from discrimination on the basis of sex, including sexual orientation or gender identity, which is what I have on this slide. So this specifically addresses sexual orientation and gender identity in schools. It interprets Title IX as being inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity. And so this means that although anti-LGBT discrimination is not a crime in many states, it does violate federal law, and thus it can be addressed by the Department of Education or Justice. And so this is really great. And there are also several reasons why local enumerated policies are still important. So first, this is an executive order that is changes with different presidents. So if we elect a president with different ideas next time, then this might be temporary. And then also, even though, this order is important, federal enforcement can only go so far. Someone has to be sued usually for these kinds of things to take place. So ensuring that local districts have these protections is really the best way to prevent discrimination at schools. Okay, so the second strategy that we're going to discuss today is GSAs, also known as gender and sexuality alliances. So first, what are GSAs? GSAs are student-led clubs that support, educate, and advocate for LGBTQ issues. So GSAs represent all of the organizing that young people do together to affirm and support one another and to fight for equity. And the GSA research is really amazing and compelling. We have data from over 1 million students in California that shows that the presence of a GSA has an influence on feelings of safety, academic achievement, and well-being for students. And then similar to enumerated policies, what's really compelling is that not only do we see these results reported for students in GSAs, but when we survey students and we look at the school level, we see that schools with GSAs are also associated with safety and well-being. So that means that on average, a school is safer if a GSA exists. It's not only safer for the kids in the GSA. Other research on GSAs shows that their purpose is diverse. It varies across schools. Some GSAs, tend to focus on mental health, others on student success, others on advocacy. And some of the factors that determine this are things like student participation, GSA advisors, and support from administrators. And when we present across the country, a common question that some educators have is, well, how do I support the GSA? How do I be a strong GSA advisor? And so we've developed this resource that you can see on the right on that topic specifically. And so if you're interested in those questions, you can go ahead and check out that short resource on our website. We also know that GSAs are really powerful, forces for positive change, but only 9 states and DC report that the majority of their secondary schools have GSAs, and there are important geographical differences. So there are fewer schools with GSAs in the South and the Midwest. I just wanted to show quickly this pretty neat graphic from the CDC that shows that there actually has been positive change in the past several years with respect to schools reporting having a GSA, and that's really great. But it's still the case that the majority of secondary schools don't have GSAs. So these percentages are still below 50% in the majority of states in the country. All right, so what on-the-ground strategies can be used to support GSAs? So professional education associations can help raise awareness of the power of GSAs and can help train educators on how to support GSAs. School personnel can learn how to support GSAs by knowing what makes a good GSA advisor, working with organizations like the National GSA Network and providing resources. And students can advocate for, start, and participate in GSAs. So another thing we hear when we're presenting to folks on the ground is that administration is telling them that they're not allowed to have a GSA at their school. It's really important to know that under federal law, a school that permits non-curricular student-led clubs can't stop students from forming a GSA. And so if you're having that experience, please email me or and I can put you in touch with folks who might be able to help out. Okay, now I want to take a minute to show an example of a story from a really amazing student who's been part of our project. And this is, an example of a student activist leveraging the science of GSAs to help found what's now one of the most important queer-focused activist groups. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Elle, and I'm a rising senior at Cedar Ridge High School in Round Rock ISD. I think GSAs are really valuable organizations because they bring people together, both in the LGBT community and among our allies. These organizations also help bolster academic performance and provide a better sense of community in our school as a whole, even for people who are not members of the club. Because I find so much value in these organizations, I founded the Central Texas GSA Coalition, which brings together GSAs in schools all across the Central Texas area, so we can work together on projects, tell each other our stories, and collaborate to bring together a better future for our community and for the world.
All right, so the third strategy that we'll talk about today is professional development around LGBTQ issues. So this refers to the training that educators receive in schools to create more positive climates for young people. So there's actually less research in this area than in some of the others that we're talking about today. But that said, what we do have is really clear research on the importance of LGBTQ supportive educators. So time and time again, when we ask young people about what matters for feeling good at school, they say that having supportive teachers is really important. And rightly so, because these supportive teachers are linked to students' academic success and their mental health. And what we also know is that the vast minority of students feel that all of their teachers are supportive. On the educator side, I'm going to argue that most educators want to be supportive of their students, but may not understand the specific needs of queer students. And the research supports this when teachers are asked why they don't intervene in LGBT-related bullying or don't participate in supportive actions. 74% of them say they don't do this because of professional pressure from the school community. So things like lack of administrative support or backlash from parents or community members, personal beliefs. So the belief that addressing the issue isn't appropriate or necessary or practical concerns. So, there's a lack of time or limited knowledge about LGBT issues. So, many report that they just don't know what to say or they don't know how. And then some also report feeling professional pressure or that it's complicated because their job is to get through their math lesson, and if they have to stop their math lesson to teach a lesson about prejudice or homophobia, then they're not doing part of their job. So it's complicated, and that's why it's so important to have inclusive policies and training for teachers about why it's important to intervene in these moments. Oops. And then the other thing that we've seen really matters is administrative leadership. So in schools where administrators take active leadership roles to push supportive policies forward, we also see in research that students have better outcomes. So we need to be training principals and administrators to lead in this area as well. So I wanted to take a minute to discuss a specific study led by the amazing Dr. Salvatore Ioverno that I collaborated on. That is some of the first work I've seen to look at how professional development directly benefits students and how this benefit may develop over time in a school community. So basically, in this figure, what we're seeing is that when schools have supported SOGI-related professional development for a longer period of time, which is 10 years in this study, LGBT students report lower victimization relative to students in schools where the policy has not existed across time. So this is a study that shows that when teachers are trained, students directly benefit, and also that it might take time for this kind of training to make an impact on the student community and school climate. Okay, so we know that teachers want training, students need supportive teachers, and professional development is associated with better student outcomes. And so in terms of professional development, one point of intervention is schools of education. So we hear from people that they've gotten an entire master's degree in education, have never talked about LGBT issues in any of their coursework or training. And so we need to be training people on these topics before they're in classrooms. Professional education associations are also points of intervention. So we're going to conferences and folks are really interested in hearing about these topics. And often there are not very many presentations that are specific to LGBTQ young people. And so we can leverage these conferences of professional education associations as spaces for professional development. School personnel can use our website and research to make the case for why they should receive this sort of training. So what the research says. Parents can support professional development by asking school administrators what kind of training there is around these topics. And students can advocate for and participate in LGBTQ focused professional development for their teachers and for other school personnel. So again, here's a video by the parents we saw before. And this time they're talking about a time when a teacher's training and initiative made their family feel included in the school community.
So hi, I'm Jim, this is Matt. We are married parents to two wonderful Chaos Tornado 5-year-old twins. So we're better known as Daddy Jim and Daddy Matt. We've had a great experience here at AISD, and I think it's the result of training and prepared teachers on how to deal with issues specific to our family and to our kids. And so more specifically, one of the more fraught days for us as a two-dad family is Mother's Day. And the teacher for one of the pre-K classrooms here in AISD saw it coming and intervened in a way that, that I think everybody really enjoyed. So instead of a specific Mother's Day event that had all mothers and us and our kid off to the side, the teacher intervened and changed it to an all-parents breakfast. So moms, dads, everybody got to come, everybody got a taco. It was a wonderful morning. And it's particularly impressive when you think that statewide, 74% of teachers have had to not intervene in an instance of anti-LGBT harassment just because of professional pressure. Whereas here, we've been lucky enough to have a teacher that saw a potential issue come up, made an adjustment that really everybody enjoyed, and everybody got to have fun, and everybody got to have a taco.
So we love our tacos here in Texas. Okay. So finally, the last safe school strategy that I want to highlight today is the importance of LGBTQ related resources in schools. So this is information and support services provided in libraries, on school websites, and on posters on walls in classrooms and hallways. There's a great science suggesting that having these kinds of resources is really important. And it's kind of intuitive to think about how it's important to see yourself represented in your curriculum. When LGBTQ topics and history are accessible, students report more safety for themselves and also more generally for LGBTQ students at the school, and they also report less bullying. Despite this, in a recent national survey, only 33% of students report that LGBTQ topics are discussed in their classes. And of these young people, more than 40% say that they're discussed in a negative light. Inclusive curricula are particularly relevant when thinking about sexuality education. We know that queer young people face greater risk for compromised sexual health from their peers due to stigma and lack of relevant sexual health information. And we also know that school-based sex ed often excludes them. This is a paper that I worked on with several fantastic colleagues, where we found that sex ed experiences that queer young people have in school stick with them over their lives. So here, we examined interview data from the Generation Study, which sampled 191 sexual minority folks across 3 different generations and 4 cities. And we found that even though there was no explicit question asked about sex ed in the interview protocol, more than a quarter of the sample mentioned sex ed when they were asked about their identity, stress, and health. And further, when remembering their sex ed experiences, the themes that emerged most commonly were things like silence, so either silence about LGBTQ identity or just a lack of sex ed, learning that queer identity was synonymous with disease or death, and feelings of stigma, so the idea that sex sexuality and queer identity as something to be fearful and shameful of. And so these exclusionary and prejudiced school-based experiences are salient for sexual minority people decades later in the life course. And we also know that when queer young people are provided with inclusive sex ed, we see reductions in riskier sexual behaviors and increases in sexual health knowledge and communication. So how can we do better by queer youth in sex ed? So here's an example of a short brief that my colleagues and I developed for Stories and Numbers, summarizing the research on the importance of comprehensive and inclusive sex ed. And we're really proud of the fact that this brief was used during last year's debates about whether the Austin Independent School District should implement an inclusive sexuality education curriculum, which the board eventually did vote for. So this is just an example of the way that these resources are getting into the hands of folks who are making positive and real change. Okay, so here are our recommendations regarding LGBTQ related resources. So we need to be infusing curricula with LGBTQ topics and history. Again, this is one of the most important things that students talk about, is learning about LGBTQ people and topics in their coursework. School personnel can be an active resource for youth by hanging flags and other visual materials, integrating LGBTQ topics into classroom curricula, and ensuring that libraries have resources available for LGBT youth. And students and parents should request that these resources be made available at the school, and can use our research briefs as leverage for the importance of having these materials available. Okay, so now I've kind of outlined the safe school strategies and recommendations for activating them, and I want to take some time to acknowledge the current policy landscape that is explicitly targeting trans youth. So in this country and across the world, gender diverse young people are being targeted at school, in medical settings, and with respect to their privacy. Very recent research is showing that these bills and even the mere discussion of them are harming children. The Trevor Project, which is a national suicide hotline for LGBTQ youth, has seen a large increase in calls to their hotline since these bills and policies have come into the spotlight. And in Arkansas, which has passed bills prohibiting affirmative health care for trans young people, more trans youth are reporting suicidality. And importantly, 2021 has been the most deadly year for homicide of trans people, largely women of color, on record. This week is Transgender Awareness Week, and so it's really important to understand the current landscape for trans and gender diverse young people and how it's influencing their health and well-being. And it's also an important first step to be showing up here to learn more about these topics. So for the purpose of this talk, I want to focus on the school context, but I also want to recommend the Society for Research on Adolescence's resources on these topics, as well as those of Equality Texas and Advocates for Youth. And I have some links at the end of this talk that provide more details and information if you'd like to learn more. And I believe that those links will also be made available in the chat. So in schools in particular, we know that trans and gender nonconforming young people are reporting worse health and lower safety relative to their cis peers. We also know that there are specific levers that drive these inequities, things like victimization, educator response, access to being able to use the bathroom, ability to use an affirmed name and to engage in sports, and these anti-trans political rhetoric. So some of the same drivers of broader LGBTQ students' health and well-being, and some factors that are unique to gender diverse students. In the lab where I work, which is Dr. Stephen Russell's lab specifically, there's been some important work on how students were able to use their affirmed name across contexts of dramatic reductions in mental health risks. So in a study with trans young people, Dr. Russell and colleagues found that trans youth who could use their affirmed names at home, at school, at work, and with friends had the lowest levels of mental health problems relative to those who are not able to use their affirmed names in these contexts. And so this is some research evidence for the importance of school policies that affirm young people's gender diverse identities. So these are recommendations specifically for trans and gender diverse students. You'll notice that many of them are overlapping with the prior recommendations presented, but some are unique. So first and foremost, we need to advocate for trans inclusive policies and laws that ensure young people's rights to be affirmed at school and to be able to meet their basic needs, such as using the bathroom or feeling safe. Adults at school must be visible and vocal allies for trans young people. Less than 5% of LGBTQ youth believe that all of their teachers are accepting of their identities. So these visual symbols and language make a huge difference. Requesting training and intervening in bullying are also really crucial ways that adults at school can make a difference. And then at the student level, students can use GSAs as organizing spaces to support, learn, and advocate for one another. And they can educate themselves on the policies that exist at their school and can affirm one another by using their affirmed names. So in closing, I just want to reiterate some of what we've covered today, which is that the empirical research makes a really clear case for the effectiveness of four main strategies: inclusive and enumerated policies, school personnel support and training, student-led clubs like GSAs, and access to LGBTQ related resources and curricula. We know that these strategies have to be multi-pronged, with buy-in from administrators who support the policies, the staff training and the inclusive curricula, educators who can enforce the policies and teach the curricula, and students and parents who can advocate for themselves and each other. And we also know that when these strategies are implemented, they improve student level well-being for all students, not just those who identify as LGBTQ. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank the Stories and Numbers team, which is made up of folks on this screen, but also so many community members across the country. Thanks to you all for listening today. And if you're interested in learning more about the topics we've discussed, here are some links to some really great resources and organizations. So that's what I have. I'm happy to take questions and comments, and thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Meg. This is fantastic information, and I think really it's concrete on the things that folks can do, parents, advocates, educators, community members. I want to encourage folks, we now have about 20 minutes for Q&A. Please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I'm also willing, if folks want to raise their hand and ask their questions verbally, I can unmute you as a panelist and give you the opportunity to ask your question, engage with our speaker. Meg, I don't know if you want to pull up the Q&A and read them as you go through them, or I'm happy to field those for you. I just ask if you do field them, if you can kind of verbalize the question so everyone can hear what you're answering.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, and sorry, if I can, sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I also just want to let folks know that we are going to end the recording at this time for the Q&A, so the Q&A will not be recorded.